I want to lead off a bit by discussing American exceptionalism. The conventional wisdom has it that the U.S. is exceptional in a variety of ways, exceptional in its commitment to a so-called free market economy, exceptional in its willingness to tolerate extreme amounts of income inequality, and what's most important for my purposes today, exceptional also in its commitment to running a high mobility regime. So the American dream, as it's sometimes rehearsed, has it that no matter how poor the family into which you're born, no matter how poor the neighborhood into which you're born, you ought to have a fair shot at getting ahead, a fair shot at entering the middle class, or even becoming rich yourself. That dream has taken a variety of forms over the course of U.S. history. In early U.S. history, it often took the form of wanting to escape from the city and secure a farm in the West. In more recent renditions, it often takes the form of wanting to go to college, or to have your children go to college, and by that fashion enter the middle class. So it's been a very prominent part of American exceptionalism to pay particular attention to social mobility. And I should say that throughout U.S. history, there have been periodic concerns that our commitment to that American dream, our commitment to running a high mobility society, hasn't been realized, and it is under threat, and that there's an increasing hardening of class boundaries, and opportunities from those who are born into poor circumstances to get ahead are no longer in play to the extent that they once were. Those concerns have surfaced time and again, and I would argue that right now, in this particular moment in U.S. history, those concerns are perhaps as prominent as they've ever been. Why are they so prominent? The principal concern, as I see it, that's been bandied about, is that the extreme income inequality that we're now experiencing in the U.S. has made it difficult for us to realize this commitment to running a high mobility regime. And I'll talk a bit about why one might think that extreme income inequality of the sort that we're now experiencing in the U.S. is problematic in that regard. But for now, simply, I would like to put forward the view that that's what's driving most of the concerns that are expressed today about a possible decline in social mobility. And those concerns are present at the highest levels. So, for example, in the last two State of the Union addresses by President Obama, he expressed very openly those concerns that we aren't realizing our commitment to having considerable opportunities for social mobility. And he's further argued in the latest State of the Union address that we ought to commit ourselves to building new ladders of opportunity into the middle class. So Sean mentioned that I should talk a bit about why we care so much in the U.S. about social mobility. There's lots and lots of reasons why people have put forward about why mobility matters. I'm going to give you just two of them to give you a sense of the lay of the land. So first off, there are folks who don't really care so much about mobility in and of itself, but they think it's an important vehicle to securing equality of outcome. So in this early period, in the takeoff in income inequality, and I've presented here this classic graph by Emmanuel Saez, along with perhaps some of Sean's work, one of the most famous graphs in social science. And in this period, this early period of the takeoff, the 1980s, the early 1990s, there were a few social scientists who were cognizant of the takeoff and were commenting upon it. And there was speculation during this early period on the part of some social scientists, mainly economists, that perhaps we need not worry too much about this takeoff in income inequality, because it's being counterbalanced by an increase in social mobility over the course of one's own life course. And the argument is that these cross-sectional snapshots of inequality are a bit misleading because they don't convey the rise in opportunities for social mobility over the life course, meaning that someone who's, for example, poor early in their life course might then have the opportunity to move upward into the middle class or even into higher circumstances later in their life course, and that if you then calculated inequality in lifetime income, it wouldn't be nearly as extreme as what one sees in the cross-section. That is, over the lifetime, some people are poor at some parts of their life. They're middle class at other parts. If you take into account lifetime earnings, in fact, the inequality that obtains isn't as extreme as a cross-sectional picture might suggest. And hence, the concern in measuring mobility on the part of such folks arises not because they really care about mobility in and of itself, but only because doing so is a way to assess whether or not indeed this cross-sectional representation of inequality is perhaps misleading and suggesting that there's more inequality than in fact obtains over an entire life course. So that's one line of interest in measuring social mobility. A second line, and I always argue a more prominent one, has it that mobility is of interest in and of itself, not just as a vehicle for assessing whether or not cross-sectional inequalities are indeed obtaining over a longer time horizon, but we have a commitment to mobility in and of itself, a commitment to mobility because it's seen as signaling whether or not there's inequality of opportunity. And so here the argument, again, is that no matter how poor you are at the point of birth, no matter how poor your neighborhood might be at the point of birth, you ought to have a fair chance at getting ahead. And the mobility table, as it's conventionally configured, allows us to gain some leverage on whether or not indeed such equality of opportunity is in play. Now, of course, it's immediately noted that measures of mobility are but an imperfect indicator of equality of opportunity. There's a variety of reasons why one could have lots of mobility in a society, and yet equality of opportunity is nonetheless not in play. But even so, typically that disjuncture is largely ignored within this tradition of scholarship, and the mobility table is seen as one important measure of whether or not our commitment to equality of opportunity is being realized. So here we don't necessarily care about whether or not there's equality of outcome. The argument is as long as we can be reassured, that everyone had an opportunity to get ahead, an equal and fair opportunity to get ahead, then all is well, even if at the end of the day there's substantial inequalities of outcome. It's simply that those opportunities are in play, whether or not they're taken up, whether or not they're realized. So within this second camp, the main concern is then that this U.S. commitment to high rates of intergenerational mobility isn't being realized. And then the idea is that there may be this second great U-turn, that there's not just rising inequality of condition, but also rising inequality of opportunity. And I want to take on that question a bit now. And the first point I want to make in assessing whether or not indeed there is a decline in social mobility in the United States is that there's shockingly little in the way of direct evidence on that question. And the main problem is that the surveys with which we typically address this question are based on extremely small samples and make it difficult to get a good read on what recent trends are telling us. We just have very small samples, and hence the evidence is at best ambiguous. Now, what type of evidence would we like to see? We want to examine the intergenerational association between social origins and social destinations. So social origins might be measured in terms of, say, social class. You might assess whether or not the parents are professionals and managers, whether or not they're routine non-manuals, craft workers, laborers of a more unskilled sort, farmers, and so forth. You would assess the parental social conditions, their social class origins, and then you want to assess the class position of children when they enter the labor force themselves later on, in terms of, say, that same type of class scheme, assessing whether or not they're professionals or managers, routine non-manuals, craft workers, and so forth. And lots of social mobility would mean that there's be lots of observations off the main diagonal in a table of that sort. Or you might instead measure the intergenerational association between the income of one's parents and one's own income when you enter the labor market. And that type of analysis is typically carried out by economists, whereas sociologists have been more interested historically in the association between social class origins or destinations. But both measures, most people would argue, are of interest in assessing the extent to which there's lots of mobility in the U.S. And then we simply would like to see trends in the amount of mobility revealed in these ways. We just don't have, as I've mentioned, the kind of evidence of that sort that we'd like, because the data that are available are based on surveys with very small samples and can't definitively speak to whether or not indeed there's rigidification of the sort that some commentators have suggested we should see. So in the absence of that direct evidence, what have we done? We've resorted often to indirect or partial measurements. For example, the work of Sean has been very, very important and has often been seen as a leading indicator of a possible decline in social mobility. That is, insofar as say, there's a growing gap in test scores between middle class and between the kids of middle class and rich parents, then you might think that might ultimately parlay into a decline in social mobility. A variety of other types of indirect evidence have also been brought to bear on this question. I want to talk about another type of indirect evidence that's been featured very prominently. So this is the so-called Gatsby curve. And on the y-axis, you have the intergenerational earnings elasticity. You can simply think of that as the payoff coming from a family that's high in earnings. It tells you the extent to which an extra dollar in earnings on the part of your family of origin will be parlayed into additional earnings on your part when you enter into the labor force. So the higher this elasticity, the greater the returns to being raised in a family with high earnings. On the x-axis, it's simply the Gini coefficient of income inequality measured in 1985. And this is a graph that was first compiled by Miles Korak and then adapted by Alan Kruger in his 2012 report to the president when he was head of the Council of Economic Advisors. So what does this graph tell us? Well, it simply says the relationship is very strong, right? That the more income inequality, the more inequality of condition, the greater the intergenerational earnings elasticity, the greater the inequality, if you will, of opportunity, speaking loosely. And so then Alan Kruger went forward and said, well, this is what obtained in 1985. So we know that since 1985, income inequality in the U.S. has grown substantially, in fact. And insofar as this relationship, which is estimated cross-sectionally, also obtains within the United States over time, that's a grand assumption, but insofar as it's on the mark, then we can estimate what the earnings elasticity would be now in light of the increased income inequality in the United States. And then he went forward and did that and said, well, the intergenerational earnings elasticity now, in light of this larger income inequality in 2010 as compared to 1985, must be approaching almost 0.6 now. This is in the report of the Council of Economic Advisors, report to the President. It was one of the bases upon which President Obama then vowed to recommit the U.S. to opening up new channels of mobility. But I would say that's pretty weak evidence. That one of our principal commitments in the United States toward social mobility ought to be based upon evidence that's a bit stronger than what's available here. So what I want to do today is talk a bit about some more direct evidence by re-examining some of the survey evidence. I've already said that survey evidence is quite weak because it's based on small samples. But I'm going to try to extract as much as I can from such evidence and make some conclusions on the basis of that evidence. I'm not going to talk too much about the research in and of itself. Sean said this should be not a research paper per se, or presentation per se, but rather try to introduce you to the larger literature. I'm going to use this research as a vehicle for doing so. I'm going to talk about two types of research, one pertaining to U.S. trend in mobility, and the second pertaining to cross-national comparisons of mobility, and see what we can glean from research of this sort, what we can glean about the relationship between income inequality, between inequality of condition, and social mobility, which is putatively said as speaking to inequality of opportunity. Before I get to the evidence, let me talk more about why you might expect income inequality and inequality of opportunity or social mobility to be related to one another. Usually we insist quite aggressively that they're analytically distinct and they need not move in tandem, but in fact, empirically, there's reason to believe that they might. And let me talk a bit about why you might think they might. And one of the arguments is of the simplest sort. Namely, insofar as those parents, if you will, at the top of the income distribution are getting more money, and rising income inequality means that they're getting more money, insofar as they have more money, they might well use that money for the purposes of affecting intergenerational reproduction. That is, they can lavish more resources on their children, and that might then assist those children when they compete to get ahead in the labor market. So what can they do with their extra money? Well, they could buy their way into a really nice neighborhood, which offers great primary and secondary schooling and assists their children in the competition for entry into a prestige college. They could buy high-quality childcare. They could buy after-school test preparation. They can do lots of things to help their children secure more human capital and hence compete more effectively down the road in getting the best positions in the labor market. They can also help their children when they're a bit older. So let's say you're one of these families that's done really well with the takeoff in income inequality. You're a professional managerial family. You have lots of money, much more money than a corresponding professional managerial family in the past might have because of this takeoff in income inequality. So you're doing well, and your child, let's say well-credentialed, got the child off into an elite college, they're in the labor market, but then the recession hits. If you're that child and the recession hits, and let's say you lose your job, if your parents are rich, they can help you out a bit, right? Instead of having to immediately take whatever job might become available, you can hold out with a high reservation wage because your parents are in the background there helping you out. They can channel some money to you. They could help you engage in a re-credentialing exercise if that seems to be necessary. They can do a lot to prevent that downward mobility that might otherwise obtain if you didn't have those rich parents in the background. So there's some things that parents can do also when their children are older that become more possible insofar as those parents have more money. So the implication is that the trend in social fluidity might well follow the trend in income inequality, with a lag depending on the extent to which those adult mechanisms are operating. Let me talk a little bit more analytically now about how income inequality and rising income inequality in particular might affect social mobility. And do so in the context of this very simple path diagram in which now education mediates between one's origin and destination. So most of what I was just discussing talks about this pathway here, right? It says that if parents are raising their children during a period in which there's lots of income inequality, then those parents at the top of the income distribution have more money, and that money can be used in a variety of ways to assist their children in getting lots of education and lots of high-quality education. There's another slightly more subtle way in which rising income inequality might affect this pathway. You might think in the long term, in the context of a highly unequal society, those at the top might withdraw their commitment for various types of public goods because they have the money to finance human capital investments all by themselves. They can pay for elite primary and secondary schools, private schools. They can pay for the gated communities. They can pay for the elite colleges, and their interest in financing public goods, such as public schools, might dissipate in the context of this high inequality regime. And that means that increasingly, if you want to affect reproduction, if you want your children to do well, you're going to need money. It's the commodification of reproduction because public goods, public subsidies of human capital investments are declining. So over the long haul, you might expect in a high inequality regime, you have these declining public subsidies. You have increasing needs for money in order to affect mobility into the middle or upper class. And hence, that's another road by which one might expect income inequality to have an effect, and in particular to make this pathway a more prominent one, to make this association between origins and educational outcomes stronger than was the case in a low inequality regime. I also made brief mention of more direct effects. That is, we talked about how, say, rich parents, when their children are floundering, say, because of a recession, how rich parents could assist those children and prevent them from falling. This is an effect that's not mediated by education and might, in the context of this very simple diagram, be seen as simply a direct effect of origin class on destination class. You protect your children from falling in the context of, say, a recession by direct assistance that might be provided that allows them to maintain a higher reservation wage. And then finally, and I haven't much talked about this at all, another way in which this origin-destination association might increase is insofar as the association between education and destination class increases. Now, usually, one of the causes of rising income inequality is seen as a growing payoff to education. You might see that then as a shared cause also of rising association between origin and destination. Let me talk now a bit about a modification of the simple income hypothesis that I just put forward. That is, the question is, who might be most likely to profit from rising income inequality and assist their children most effectively in bringing about reproduction? And the answer to that question is probably professionals and managers. What we have here is a graph showing simply which social classes most profited from the takeoff in income inequality. This is just the 2008 dollars in thousands for 6 groups: professionals and managers, skilled manual, unskilled manual, technical sales and administrative support, farming, forestry and fishing, and service. Six classes. Which ones are doing the best during this takeoff period? Well, the answer is, of course, those at the top are really pulling away especially prominently, and that's professionals and managers. So they're the ones who have the money, the increasing amount of money that would make it possible for them to assist their children in doing well themselves. And so if you're going to see the effects of rising income inequality within the context of a mobility table, you might especially see lots of professional managerial reproduction, because it's professional managerial parents who are getting the money and then can use that to assist their children. Now, some folks have also argued that class is additionally very anxious about reproduction. They're very invested in reproduction. They have high concerns about reproduction, and hence, insofar as they have more money, they're especially likely to use it for purposes of reproduction. So when they have more resources, they're going to plow it into their children, and the takeoff is all about those families, as is shown here, having more resources. So there's lots of reasons to think that rising income inequality might lead to declining social mobility. But one has to bear in mind that while all of this takeoff has happened in the U.S. and in some other countries, there's lots of countervailing forces at work as well that might undermine these putative effects of the takeoff. I'm just going to give you one example of a countervailing effect. And because I'm in a school of education, a graduate school of education, I'm going to give you a countervailing effect that involves education, although there are a great many others that one might draw upon as well. And here I'm drawing upon the work of Michael Hout and also Florencia Torche. It talks about a compositional effect on social mobility. And in particular, it goes like this. What Mike Hout found, and has been subsequently borne out in later research by Florencia and others, is that those who have completed college, if you restrict your attention to those who have completed college, there's in fact virtually no association between origins and destinations within that group. So it's as if a college education is the great equalizer, in the sense that social origins don't matter anymore in terms of your destinations among those who graduate from college. And so as a growing proportion of the population shifts into that no association region, you're going to have an overall decline in the amount of association revealed in a mobility table. So more and more folks going to college, more and more folks are then shifted into a region in which there's no or very little origin by destination association, and that then mechanically translates into a decline in the amount of association in the table as a whole. So what we have here is a graph of the percentage of young adults, those between 25 and 40 years old, with a bachelor's degree, and you see that over time, over the time period that I'll be examining subsequently, you see that there's an increase. Not as much as is obtaining in other countries, but there is nonetheless some increase in the proportion of the population with a bachelor's degree, and it's especially prominent, as you well know, for women. So this is a countervailing force insofar as the Hout effect plays out as a greater proportion of the population is in college. So let me turn now to some results. With that backdrop, and these are results that are coming out of a paper that I wrote with Pablo Mitnick and Aaron Cumberworth. And what we argued is that past scholars have failed to find any evidence of trend within surveys like the General Social Survey, because they haven't properly targeted their analyses to those groups that are most likely to be affected by the takeoff. And first off, you have to realize that it's youngsters in the present period who are the ones who are most affected by takeoff. And by youngsters, I mean those who are, say, aged 25 to 40 in the present day. Those are the ones who grew up under conditions of the takeoff. So they're the ones who could have profited from all the human capital investments that their parents could make by virtue of having more money. And secondarily, you want to think principally about professional managerial reproduction as where you're going to see possible evidence of the takeoff. Why? Because as I already mentioned, it's professionals and managers who were the main beneficiaries of the takeoff. They're the ones who got most of the extra money that the takeoff delivered, and they're the ones, therefore, that can use that money to assist their children. So all that we did, and we did lots of stuff in this paper, but I'm just going to give you a very simple example of what we did. We just created a very simple odds ratio that compares professional managerial parents versus all other parents. So it's like a two-class rendition. Your parents are either professionals or managers or they're not. And then we asked whether or not their children were professionals or managers or not. It's a 2-by-2 table. It's a single odds ratio, but it's an important one. And then we examined the extent to which that odds ratio became stronger or weaker over time, both for the father by daughter odds ratio and the father by son odds ratio. We don't, unfortunately, over this time period, have evidence on mothers, although we do for just this this latest decade. But I'm not talking about that here. And what do we see? Well, we see for that father by daughter odds ratio, there is indeed an increase. It's about a 40% increase in the size of that log odds ratio, and for sons, it's about a 20% increase in the size of that log odds ratio. Notice that the decline here is especially prominent for daughters, and presumably it's because this is a period of time in which they entered into mass education, college education, in a very, very aggressive way, and that had presumably the Hout effect to which I referred, that compositional effect that drives down the association. But if you believe the story that we're weaving, that effect became overwhelmed by the income inequality effect that plays out in this most recent decade. What about older adults? So remember, this is for 25 to 40-year-olds, the people who experience the takeoff when they're growing up during this most recent period. What if you look at older adults? Those between, I think it's 45 and 60 here. They didn't experience the takeoff. So if you're between 45 and 60 in the 2000s, you grew up before the takeoff, principally. And you see no evidence among those older folks, no evidence of an increase in the association between origins and destinations, either for fathers or for daughters. Sorry, either for sons or for daughters. So those results are only suggestive. The trends that I just referred to, the ones here, comparing the extent of the association in the 2000s to that obtaining the 1990s, that difference is only barely significant. And so even with this highly targeted approach, we can still say that the results are just suggestive. But it is the first evidence of which I'm aware of rigidification of the sort that some folks have feared might be in play. Let me turn next to some cross-national results. Remember what I displayed to you, the Gatsby curve? Those are cross-national results as they obtain for economic mobility. That is, we looked at the intergenerational earnings elasticity and showed that gets larger as income inequality within a country gets larger. And so among economists who focus on economic mobility, there's a considerable consensus that there's a strong relationship between how unequal a society is and how much mobility is found within that society. But one of the conundrums in the field is that among sociologists who focus on class mobility, not economic mobility, but class mobility, the conventional wisdom is that there's not much difference across countries at all. That there's pretty much a grand constant when it comes to how much mobility is in evidence, and all countries are more or less the same as to the amount of mobility that's in play. That conclusion, though, has not been tested against the most extreme forms of inequality that are principally witnessed in less developed countries. So what Enrique Huerta, Ezra Burek, and myself did recently is to say, well, let's take a look at how much social mobility there is in one of the most unequal, rich countries around, and that's Mexico. So here's the Gini coefficient for Mexico. Among all the OECD countries, it's extremely high. The number two position is the United States. We think it's high in the United States, but income inequality is rather higher in Mexico. So it makes for a nice comparison. It might be seen as revealing what our future in the U.S. holds for us. I should note also that if you break down the Gini coefficient and look at the 90-50 and 50-10 ratios, the 90-50 are in blue here and the 50-10 are in gray. You'll see that the big difference between Mexico and the U.S. is with respect to the 90-50, what's in blue here. So here's the 90-50 for Mexico. Here's the 90-50 for the U.S. You see they're very, very different. They're not, what I should say, though, is the 50-10 ratios aren't all that different between Mexico and the U.S. So the implication is again that if you think those at the very top in the U.S. are doing really well, take a look at Mexico. They're doing even better. The 90-50 in Mexico is quite magnificent as compared to what you see in the U.S. What that means then is that those at the very top in Mexico might be the ones that are doing extremely well when it comes to assisting their children and making reproduction possible. That extra money that they get in Mexico as compared to the U.S. might be used for the purposes of human capital investments in their children for the direct purchase of credentials, especially because in Mexico reproduction is highly commodified. There's a lot of private high-cost schooling. Now, there is one confounding effect. Well, there's lots, but there's one that is perhaps especially troubling. You want to set up the conceit with all these cross-national comparisons as the countries are identical in all respects except for the one variable whose effect you want to demonstrate. That one variable in this case being income inequality. That's quite an extraordinary conceit. There's lots of other differences between these countries. But one that kind of looms large is familism. That is, the argument is that in Mexico, other Latin American countries too, there's very strong pressure, especially strong cultural pressure, to meet family expectations. And so children feel like they really ought to carry on with their family occupation, or so some have argued. And so insofar as we see more immobility in Mexico than in the U.S., it might be just because of this cultural familism rather than the effects of income inequality. So I want to address that by purging out detailed occupational reproduction. That is, if familism is at work, it means that the children might inherit, if you will, precisely the same occupation as their parent. But they're not going to inherit the same big class. That would be the effect of income inequality as opposed to familism. So I wanted to make it a distinction in this particular case between detailed occupational reproduction and reproduction at the larger big class level. So let me lay out how we did that. By big class reproduction, I simply mean the tendency of, say, the children of those born into the classical professions, like professors, doctors, lawyers, the tendency for children born into those classical professions to enter themselves the classical professions, or the tendency of children whose parents are managers or officials to themselves become managers and officials, or the tendency of children of craft workers to become craft workers, and so forth. This is reproduction at the big class level. And you want to distinguish between that type of reproduction and instead more detailed occupation reproduction. So the tendency of the child of a professor to become a professor, the child of a librarian to become a librarian, the child of a bookkeeper to become a bookkeeper, and so forth. That's the kind of reproduction that might be driven by familism. And hence we want to net that out and just look at the residual big class reproduction and see if that's more extreme in Mexico, where income inequality is very high as compared to the U.S. So let me lay out first what reproduction in the U.S. looks like. We have here a three-dimensional mobility table. So what we've started off with is the occupation of, in this case, the father, because we don't have data on mothers here. Occupation of the father. That occupation is captured in 124 categories. So these are very detailed categories. They're categories that represent, say, professor or engineer, librarian, bookkeeper, truck driver, and so forth. Very detailed occupations for the father in this case, and then also the son or daughter. And you examine the extent to which there are observations in each of the 124 times 124 cells in this mobility table. And these bars, the vertical height of them indicates the extent to which there are densities within those cells. And so what you see first off is that there's a big tendency for occupational reproduction. That is, there's a big tendency for children to remain in the same occupation as their parents. And then net of that, you see these little plateaus here, which indicate various types of big class reproduction. So there's a tendency for children who are born into the non-manual class to remain as non-manuals themselves. So this whole zone is elevated. And likewise, there's a tendency for children born into the manual class to remain as manuals. And then you see a little extra zone, extra density here that's reproduction within the classical profession. So if your parents are lawyers or doctors, then you're likely as a child to yourself become a lawyer or doctor. And so this is the kind of big class reproduction to which I'm referring and that I'm saying should be sensitive to the amount of income inequality in the country. So that's the U.S. The main conclusion is that there's more of that big class immobility in Mexico than in the U.S. On average, the tendency for big class reproduction is greater in Mexico than in the U.S. And that is especially pronounced, I should say, at the very top of the class structure. So the children of professionals and managers are especially likely in Mexico to become professionals and managers. The children of proprietors in Mexico are especially likely to become proprietors. The classical professions, these are the kind of the elite of the professional class. There's much more reproduction in Mexico than in the U.S. And likewise, there's much more reproduction among managers and officials in Mexico than in the U.S. So this is exactly what you would expect via the top income hypothesis. Namely, those at the very top of the class structure are the main beneficiaries of income inequality, and they seem to be able to use that extra money for the purposes of more successful reproduction, at least as compared to the U.S. So is mobility in Mexico distinctive? Yes, it's very distinctive. There's a lot of immobility. And there's a distinctively strong tendency to remain within your big class of origin. You can't explain that in terms of detailed occupational reproduction that might be seen as an effect of the cultural commitment within Mexico for children to remain in the particular detailed occupations of their parents. Even when you net that out, you still see evidence of more reproduction in Mexico than in the U.S., and that's consistent with the top income hypothesis. So one might say then that Mexico is our future with respect to mobility. If current trends continue to play out with respect to income inequality, then you might expect an increase in immobility in the U.S. That's of the sort that you see within Mexico. So where are we now? What have I so far laid out? Well, first off, there's some evidence of rigidification in the U.S. that occurred just as income inequality took off. So it's a bit of a smoking gun. It only obtains within young folks who were exposed to the takeoff when they were children. If you then examine mobility by contrast within older folks who weren't exposed to the takeoff as children, you don't see evidence of that rigidification. So it's suggestive that the increase in the association between origins and destinations is linked to the takeoff in the U.S. When you turn to a cross-national comparison and compare the U.S. with Mexico, one of the most unequal rich countries around, you see that indeed Mexico has more immobility, and especially so at the very top of the class structure, which was the principal beneficiary which is the principal beneficiary of extreme inequality. And so I would say these results are suggestive, but clearly not definitive. So I want to conclude by talking about how we might build a better infrastructure. This will lead into the results that Chetty will be presenting in a couple weeks. I think there are two ways in which you could build a better infrastructure for measuring social mobility. Clearly, it's one of our important commitments, and we ought to do a bit of a better job, I would argue, in terms of monitoring whether or not we're living up to that commitment. That commitment to have a high mobility regime. So let me talk about two ways in which we might build a better infrastructure. Start off with the IRS. And this is the infrastructure that Chetty will be discussing when he comes here in a couple weeks. And the key point here is that starting in 1987, if you wanted to claim your children as a dependent, the IRS required that you report their Social Security number. You, of course, also know the Social Security number of the parents themselves, and so that provides a link between the Social Security number of parents and that of their children. So then you can go and follow those children, now knowing their Social Security number, follow those children to the point when they themselves enter the labor market, and you can use then their earnings and income reports that are provided on 1040 form to assess the extent to which the income of children is similar to that of their parents. This is precisely what Chetty and his co-authors use. They do it for data from 1996 to 2011. And he'll be talking about some of the extraordinary results that they secure through this approach. I should say, though, that the kids that they have come from the 1980 to 81 birth cohort, and hence they're quite young when they can be traced when they themselves enter the labor market. They're quite young, and hence they haven't realized what's often understood as their permanent income. And so the evidence that they can provide will be tentative precisely because they're just not old enough yet, because they're drawing on 1996 to 2011 data. With Pablo Mitnick, I'm carrying out a parallel analysis using an earlier sample, a 1987 sample, the very first year when filers were asked to report the Social Security numbers of their dependent children. We just have a sample, whereas Chetty has all the data, and that allows him to carry out the geographic analysis on which he'll report. We just have a 1987 sample, but it does allow us to secure evidence on children when they're much older, when they're closer to what's often understood as their permanent income. We don't yet have those results. We will in a couple months, and it should be quite extraordinary because for the first time we'll have evidence on the amount of reproduction at the very top of the distribution among the very, very rich, and the extent to which their children are as rich as their parents. Now, why is the IRS approach a very promising one? Well, first off, the data are pretty high quality. The income data are pretty high quality. This is a fascinating result that's produced by David Johnson and Fixler, in which they matched the income reports provided on the current population survey to those that are provided on IRS Form 1040. So it's actual same individuals. They're matched through their Social Securities. And then you can compare the income they report on the current population survey, which is our main labor market survey in the country, with that's reported on that IRS Form 1040. Each of these blue dots pertains to a percentile, each of the 100 percentiles. So at the very top of the income distribution, you see that just a little bit more than 20% of the IRS income is reported in the CPS. So you're getting massive underreporting at the top end of the distribution by relying on surveys. Presumably you're getting much better data by instead of relying on the IRS. So that's an asset by using this kind of infrastructure that Chetty will be discussing in a few weeks. But are these data likely to be the answer in terms of building an infrastructure for monitoring mobility in this country? I would say they're not the full and complete answer. Why? First off, they don't do a good job with the poor. If you're really poor, and especially if you're not working, you're not likely to file. You don't have to file. You're not going to get anything back. You're not going to get the EITC if you're not working. And hence, those folks aren't represented. And we really want to know whether or not there's reproduction of poverty. And the IRS isn't going to give us a good read on that. And then there's also all sorts of other missing data on the IRS forms that matter to us. The IRS is under obligation to do what it's supposed to do, collect taxes, and it's not under the obligation to assist with social science, and hence it may not be the full and complete answer. I would suggest it's not. A very important resource, but probably not one upon which we should base all of our investigation about trends in mobility. So I want to conclude by talking about another approach. It's one that actually I'm working on with Sean, that develops instead an administrative register that exploits not just the IRS data, but lots of other data that are potentially available. And the argument here is that, in fact, we have a register in the U.S. It's often thought that, in fact, Scandinavia is the only place where real registers can be found, but in fact we have a register here. It's just in pieces, and we need to assemble it. And key in carrying out that assembly is recognizing that there are a variety of ways in which parents and children can be linked. First off, when you give birth in a hospital, often right there in the hospital you fill out Form SS5, which I've reproduced here. And in Form SS5, you're applying for a Social Security number for your child, and in so doing, you list the Social Security number of the mother and father. So right there, you have a link, right? The Social Security of children, numbers of children, are linked to that of their presumed biological parents. Now let's think about the census. If you co-reside in the same unit, you can use that to infer, say, social parenthood. And that, too, then secures the link. There are a variety of ways in which the census uses the data in the long form to infer what the Social Security number might be. That can be done quite successfully. And so you can use, then, the inferred Social Security numbers via co-residency when children are young and living with their social parents. You can use that to then trace the earnings or occupation of those children in other administrative data, like the American Community Survey, the Internal Revenue Service Form 1040, Social Security earnings reports. There's all sorts of ways in which you can then trace the earnings and occupation of children in subsequent assessments. So the point, then, is that because we have, or I should say one other way in which we can get a linkage between parents and children, and that's, of course, in the IRS itself, which we already discussed. So one could piece together all those data and have, in effect, a register. Now, of course, this is hardly a perfect solution. First off, the data would only be analyzable in secure data centers because they're sensitive. And so you couldn't have as much access as ideally you would want. It would have to be controlled access. Insofar as one had access also to IRS data, it would have to be obviously under the control of the IRS, and they're very, very careful, and rightly so, about maintaining confidentiality. So, for example, in the analyses that I'm carrying out with a memorandum of understanding with the IRS, we don't ever see the data. They've given us a fake data set with fake numbers in it, but mimics the structure of the real data. We try out our programs on those fake data. We send them to the IRS. They run them for us. They check the output very carefully to make sure that nothing confidential ever comes back to us. It's only summary statistics. And then we use those to carry out the analyses. So those sorts of confidentiality provisions would obviously have to be in place insofar as scholars had access to IRS data. And even if they didn't have access to the IRS data, presumably all the analyses would have to be carried out in secure data centers. So this solution is by no means perfect, but I think it might well yield much promise for the future. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
I just had a question about one of the charts you showed on the Mexico versus U.S. correlation coefficients. The professional managerial class is 0.14. That seems awfully low. That means professional. I take that to mean the children of professional managers in the U.S. rarely become professional managers. Is that what that means?
No. So these are coefficients that are in additive form. So you need to take their exponent. And the exponent of 0.14, I think, might be something like, well, what it would suggest roughly is that if you're in the professional managerial class, I think it's something like you might be 1.2 times more likely to remain in that class than to exit it. Now, you might not say that's very large, additional increment in your chances of being a professional or manager if your parents are professionals or managers. But you have to bear in mind this is a net effect. It's net of a whole host of other ways in which reproduction occurs. So, in addition, there's, for example, sectoral reproduction, which means simply your likelihood if you're born into the non-manual class to remain within the non-manual class. So there's an additional residue of reproduction that obtains that way. There's also gradational reproduction, which is another type of socioeconomic reproduction. So I'm trying in this analysis to parse out the many ways in which reproduction occurs so we can target where it's happening and where it's not happening. So this is just a net effect of a particular type of reproduction at the big class level. So you have to add up all the different sources of reproduction to get a total amount of reproduction. And that's why this comes across as rather small.
So one of the ways you suggested that rising inequality might lead to lower social mobility is through this commodification of reproduction. That is, the rich kind of invest less in public goods as inequality rises because they can buy whatever their kids need. So do we have any good evidence of whether that happens, either cross-sectionally or longitudinally? It seems to me we don't have good evidence of the trends in mobility because they take a long time to emerge, and we haven't collected the data to do it. But we might have evidence of kind of these shorter-term mechanisms. But do we?
Not that I know of. So that was a wholly speculative comment. Maybe a political scientist, if there's one in the audience, could speak to research on that question. I suppose you could assess it in the cross-section in the sense that simply whether or not those who are rich are less supportive of public goods. I believe that is likely the case. And so then you might then extrapolate from that cross-sectional relationship and imagine that as income inequality continues apace, it would lead to reduction in support for public goods. I'm actually not familiar with that literature, but I wouldn't be surprised if it plays out in the way that I just described. Although I would say that I'm not necessarily sure that that's an immediate effect that would be witnessed. I think it's more of an effect that you think over the long haul, because it takes a long time to ramp down your investments in a public infrastructure. It's something that I think you've seen to some extent in the U.S., but it's a long process, and its effects would be witnessed, I would think, over the long term. I guess the other point that I'd make in that regard is that it's not simply that our public investments might have been ramped down as income inequality increases, but also that you need more and more of those public investments to counteract rising income inequality. So if, for example, the rich are increasingly retreating into gated communities in which everything is privatized, in which the whole reproduction process, if you can envision this, is privatized, right? And they're getting a very high-quality type of reproduction, lots of investment in their children's human capital, really high-quality child care, everything that a gated community can provide. So now if you're going to compensate for that by trying to provide public goods for all the rest of us who aren't in those gated communities, you need a lot of investments in public goods to catch up, as it were, to that kind of investment. And so it's not simply that we need to maintain our existing amount of public goods investment, but in the context of this increasing income segregation of the sort that you've discussed, increasing privatization of reproduction, you need a lot of investments in public goods to play that catch-up game. And so it's not just that you need to maintain steady state, but arguably you need yet more. And so by that criterion, it's perhaps a losing battle.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is how much mobility, social mobility, is a significant mobility? Because when we talk about lower mobility, does it mean that everybody stays the same, or because maybe someone from lower middle class go to higher middle class, or someone rich goes to be richer? So how, when we are studying social mobility, how do we account for this small, or mobility, let's say? And the second question is, how is downwards mobility in the United States? Because so far we've just been thinking about social mobility as people from lower social classes going up.
Yeah, so I should say that the kinds of models that I was discussing here, and Sean advised me not to get too much into the methodological details, and so I apologize because it's as a result difficult perhaps to follow what I presented. But the kinds of models that I presented here control, as it were, for changes in the distributions of the sizes, changes in the sizes of the social classes themselves. And so much of the upward mobility that one's historically seen in the U.S. arose because of an increase, say, in the size of the professional managerial class. And that then motivated a lot of upward mobility to meet that demand for ever more professionals and managers. That kind of effect is controlled for in these sorts of models, and I'm simply examining the association between origins and destinations, which is another way of saying in the competition for those increasing number of professional managerial positions, who has the advantage? Which social class origins have the advantage in that competition? And has the extent of that advantage changed over time? So the upshot is that these kinds of models don't speak to upward and downward mobility, but rather simply to the association between origins and destinations.
Can I follow up, David?
Yeah.
Because I think this is a very interesting and sorry about that. I want to follow up because I think conceptually this is a very good, it's an interesting question, and so this is perhaps more of a conceptual question, and just to think about. So how do we define mobility, right? And is it moving? You know, is there an objective indicator in terms of dollars? Is it moving from one class, one sector to the other in terms of, you know, the different categories you have there, from the classical professional from the manual to the classical? Like, how is it, you know, 10% move in earnings? Like, what is the definition? I can imagine that one can envision multiple definitions, or multiple indicators rather, of mobility. So what is the indicator and I guess I didn't know that. What is the indicator that is more conventionally used? And then what are some of the problems with using that conventional indicator? And you've already talked about other things we wish we could have. But this is more of a conceptual question, I think.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah. What's your question? Yeah.
I think there are two competing traditions that I should briefly discuss. One is developed mainly within economics and examines mobility in terms of income or earnings. And typically it's done so through the measurement of the intergenerational earnings elasticity that I discussed. And it's simply how much payoff you get to having an extra dollar of familial income. But also within that tradition, they might examine mobility tables of the sort that I've just discussed, but the mobility tables typically defined by, say, income quintiles. And so you'd have a 5-by-5 table, and you'd examine how individuals move between those quintiles. So that's one tradition, and it's a tradition in which mobility is defined in terms of money. The other tradition that's developed mainly within sociology focuses instead on social classes of the sort that I've presented here. And I think the logic, no one would deny the importance of money and examining mobility, I think, in terms of earnings or income. And indeed, some of the research that I'm carrying out is of that sort. And I don't think anyone can deny its importance. But in addition, I think the argument for measuring mobility in terms of social classes is that these are omnibus measures of one's life chances. There's lots of evidence that suggests that social class matters in terms of your lifestyles, in terms of your life chances, in terms of your politics, in terms of your consumption practices. These are very meaningful groups for individuals and structure their lives in very powerful ways. And you ought not simply abstract away from all that and look at money and money alone. You need to look at these institutionalized categories as well. One reason why I think it's very important to do so is that in another line of research that I didn't much discuss, what I've shown is that, let me see if I can, what I've shown is that much of the way in which class reproduction has occurred, whereby class we mean big classes like managers, professionals, clericals, sales, much of the way in which that happens is through this detailed occupational reproduction. That's one of the big mechanisms for class reproduction. So the tendency for the children of professors to be professors, the children of engineers to be engineers, the children of bakers to be bakers is very, very important in terms of affecting this class reproduction. And also, I might add, likely in terms of affecting economic reproduction. So you don't want to ignore the institutions through which reproduction occurs, and I think the class methodology allows you to pay closer attention to highly institutionalized groups and how they reproduce themselves.
Oh, hi. I have two questions. One is, what is a problem to the society if the social mobility decreases? I have studied sociology and education in Japan, and there we say the crime rate will rise if the mobility decreases. So, and I'm not familiar with here, so I would like to know what's discussed over here. And my another question is, are you able to analyze people who are moving between the countries? Because I really feel that people who are rich move to the United States, especially from like China, Korea, and Japan, who wants to have higher education to their kids. So do you have that kind of analysis? Thank you.
Those are tough questions. I think the presumption is that mobility plays a very important legitimating effect. So the claim is that one reason why folks, say in the U.S., are so tolerant of the extreme inequality, income inequality that now obtains, one reason why they're so tolerant is that they believe that there's some amount of equal opportunity, that the outcome of this competition to get ahead is run by relatively fair and merit-based rules, and that insofar as they can believe that the rules are fair, that the competition is fair, that the race is fairly run, then they can abide by the extreme inequality that obtains. And so that legitimating role for mobility is very important. And if you withdraw that legitimating effect, if mobility begins to dissipate, begins to decline, if class lines harden, then the claim would be that inequality then is called into question. I think that's the main sort of effect of mobility that typically is offered up. As for evidence for that claim, I think it's relatively weak. That is, I just don't know evidence on that point one way or another. But it's certainly a well-rehearsed claim. Lots of people believe it's important. You can certainly see evidence of its importance in, say, the Occupy protests, where a lot of the rhetoric that called income inequality into question focused on the rules by which riches were secured and suggested that those rules were not fair and merit-based, but instead the competition was a rigged one. And people were beginning, so it's argued, to withdraw their support for the extreme inequality in the U.S. precisely because they didn't see the race as being fairly run, but rather was rigged. So I think some of the evidence for that kind of rhetoric could perhaps be found in the most recent protests. But nonetheless, I think it would be a good area in which to carry out more research and to see if indeed that long argued effect is indeed in play.
Hi. I want to take it back to your initial point about the American dream, which is really this idea that we can get ahead. And so your presentation is very convincing about professional and managerial classes, but does it speak to the poor or the lower middle classes? Is there a crowding out effect, essentially, that if the other professionals are intensifying their reproduction, does that mean that then the poor are less likely to be able to do that because there are fewer opportunities, or because of the changing structure of the economy? Does that mean it's not necessarily mutually exclusive that the poor then couldn't also be rising if the economy is changing and whatnot? So, is that clear? Question? Okay.
Yeah. Another good question. Indeed, insofar as professional managerial reproduction grows larger over time, it means that the available slots that are open to others diminishes, right? And so now the rest of the labor market is competing for the residue that's left over after the ever larger share is already grabbed by those who are born into the professional managerial class. So it is a zero-sum game, and all that one can say is that zero-sum game gets disguised insofar as there's an increase in the number of professional managerial slots, right? So you could imagine an increase in the amount of reproduction within the professional managerial sector, but if that's laid on top of all sorts of macroeconomic forces that increase the size of the professional managerial sector, it's not going to be as readily felt. So if, in other words, Stanford decides to increase the number of legacy slots, but at the same time decides to increase the size of its class, then perhaps there would be less in the way of objections to that increase in the number of legacy slots because it's concealed by an increase in the number of slots. Well, the same phenomenon might play out within the labor market as a whole, insofar as forces are at work to increase the size of the professional managerial sector. It could disguise the ever larger reproduction that occurs within that sector. I think that gets back to Prudence's very important point that you want to take into account those structural shifts, because they're going to have implications perhaps for the way in which the population reacts to changes in the amount of reproduction.
I actually want to know what others think about this as well, but you've sort of implied that if we had good data, and we could see over the last 50 years or something, suppose we saw that social mobility had not declined at all. Inequality went up a lot, but social mobility was the same as it was 50 years ago. Should we care about rising inequality then? And some of what you've said suggests we shouldn't worry so much about inequality under those conditions. But I don't know if that's what you mean to imply, and I'm sort of would be curious to know what others think about that. Is is the only reason we care about inequality because we think it means social mobility declines. And if that turns out not to be true, we're okay with it.
I was representing, I think, how the general population is said to think about such things, rather than how I think about such things. I think you're asking what I think, rather than what people say others think. And so, yeah, the conventional wisdom is that people care about income inequality, especially if they think it's not fairly won, if they think the competition isn't a fair one, but that insofar as they think it's unfair, then they start to call it into question. That's the conventional wisdom about how the population thinks about such matters. How do I think about such matters? I think there's lots of reasons to care about income inequality that go beyond simply whether or not it's fairly won. You want me to? Okay. Insofar as lots of things are commodified, insofar as we're increasingly operating within an economy and society in which access is commodified, you have to believe that access is fairly judged by simply one's capacity to pay for it. I think there's lots of goods out there, like, say, health goods, that we don't believe should be allocated on the basis of one's capacity to pay for it. And so I think income inequality becomes increasingly problematic insofar as it's carrying out in the context of extreme commodification, in which we claim that the way in which we allocate scarce goods is through people's capacity to pay for it. And I think some of those scarce goods, and one of the obvious culprits here would be health, ought not be allocated in that way. And rising income inequality becomes increasingly problematic then, insofar as it's conjoined with this commodification commitment. That's just one example. But I'd be interested too in what others might say on this point. Preaching to the choir. What do you think, Sean?
I think, for some of the same reasons you suggested, suppose somebody asked you to play a game in which you were to flip a coin, and if it was heads, you'd get $10, and if it was tails, you'd lose $10. That's a game you might be willing to play, and it might be fair. But if someone asked you to play a game that said, if it's heads, you get $1 million, and if it's tails, you're an indentured servant for the rest of your life because you don't, unless you have $1 million to pay or something, you might say, well, that doesn't. The upside, even though it's sort of equal in some sense, the upside is, the downside is too strong. I don't want to play that game. And so while it might be sort of fair in some sense if you were asked to play that game and you could decline, but if you're born into a game where you don't get, in some sense, to decide whether you play that game, then it seems unfair for the game to have those stakes attached to it. And I think that's what a society that has high levels of inequality and some level of social immobility is essentially asking kids to be born into a game with really, really high stakes that they didn't agree to play in. And so I think it might be okay to ask them to play in a game where the stakes were low that they didn't get to decide if they participated in. But when the stakes are that high, it seems like it's unfair not to have a chance to decline to play in the game. And so in some sense, that's a more philosophical way of sort of saying the consequences are really big to it, like because of its association with lots of other outcomes like health and whatnot, that we shouldn't rig the game that way without everyone sort of agreeing that they wanted to play it.
I thought where you're going, and maybe you would be going here, is that let's say that the payoff to education is extraordinarily high in this high inequality regime. extremely high payoff. So let's say it's a skill-biased technological change sort of story in which what's driving rising inequality is simply increasing returns to education. And so that means that we are asking our children to make fateful decisions about investments. Even if you could wave your wand and say that everyone has equal access to schooling and financial constraints are eliminated and neighborhood effects are eliminated and there's free and open access to schooling, and anyone who wants to secure quality schooling could. So you get rid of all the mobility problems, right? You wave your wand. Even so, I thought you were going to say it's just asking too much of children to make those fateful investment decisions when so much depends on them. It's just a very fraught coin flip as to whether or not, say, they invest in schooling. Because we know that if they do make that investment, they're going to reap tremendous returns. And if they don't, they won't. And it's asking too much of youngsters to make such fateful decisions. But that's not where you're going. Because you were hinging, I thought, your critique of extreme inequality not on simply the consequences of decisions, but rather on the mobility question.
Yeah, I mean, this is not my only objection to inequality, but if there were perfect social mobility so that the family you were born into had absolutely no relationship with where you ended up, if it really were a sort of a coin flip, that might be one thing, though I still don't like that the stakes are that high. But the fact that there's some social immobility, and actually, relatively high immobility, then the fact that you don't get to decide whether to play in the game seems particularly unfair.
Yeah. But that's sort of the conventional critique of inequality in the context of high immobility, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about assumptions a bit, because I think even if we play these thought experiments, in the real world, if you think about what the credentialists talk about, let's say, go back to your example, that there's open access. We don't have to worry about the financial constraints. So you get a large supply of highly educated people and there is some mobility. Is it real? Is it really possible that there is such a demand for all of these college-educated people if we were able to move up? Now, this is the flip thought experiment in some ways. In the idea that in a political economy like the one we have in the United States, is there really room to move up a massive number of people from the bottom to the top? Or is it that the system only thrives in the way that it does with a smaller percentage of highly educated people in the United States? So this is questioning the myth, or actually positing that there may be a myth, rather. And that, we often tout and try to socialize our children to believe that there is a big pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but for how many? And I think that, is it really, are those, and perhaps this is what, to figure out what the demand is. Are there really that many jobs in this knowledge-based, technologically advanced society that will move that many people? I guess the question, the bottom line is, what evidence do we have that we have enough room to move millions of people up into the professional and managerial classes?
Another amazingly great question. But I have two reactions to that. I would fully and completely and unhesitatingly embrace, as I suspect you two would, eliminating all of those barriers that preclude people from securing high-quality primary and secondary training and then going on to college if they so wish. And why do I think that would be so amazing? First off, it would address the equality of opportunity problem, which is an extraordinary one. It's a commitment that I think all of us honor in the breach, and we ought to honor it in reality and sweep away all those constraints. But that's just with respect to equality of opportunity. What would it do with equality of condition? I think the effects would be profound, because as more people flow into the college sector and secure that college credential, it's going to drive down wages to those folks who are credentialed in that way. It will increase unemployment within the college-educated sector. That's a good thing. Why is that a good thing? Because whoever said that if you're college educated, you should be spared all the burdens of unemployment? Of course, we'd rather lower unemployment for everyone. But insofar as it's zero sum, why should unemployment be suffered mainly among those who aren't educated? And those who are educated, well educated, have very low unemployment rates. Wouldn't it be better, all else equal, if you had a fixed number of unemployment slots, as it were, wouldn't it be better to share the pain? And if you had more educated folks, there'd be more unemployment within that sector. It'd be equalizing. Presumably, if it was a fully competitive market, people would flow into the college-educated sector up to the point where their unemployment rates would be equal to that of those who aren't college-educated. So it would share the pain of unemployment. It would reduce the returns to college in a way that would reduce inequality. It would lower the cost of educated labor such that it would be more competitive on the world market. There'd be more employers who would be hiring college-educated labor because it's cheaper, so there'd be more slots, and hence it would be a very benign circle in which I don't see any downside. It would be an amazing effect of rising equality of opportunity on equality of condition, and lead to all sorts of good things. So I see no downside of the sort that you painted a very, very pessimistic picture of what a reduction in those barriers would imply. And I see, to the contrary, nothing but an upside to eliminating inequalities of opportunity.
Right, but so we're assuming that there would be no other factors, intersecting forces or factors in there, because I'm thinking about even if you get you expand the number, the percentage, or allow the college educated to experience some of the burden of unemployment, is that an economically efficient thing to do? You've invested all of this into the cultivation of this human capital. So there's some costs there, right? Some big costs, given the growing cost of college education, right? Now you have these underemployed or unemployed persons. And then the thing about it is there is a push-out effect, perhaps. I mean, could one argue alternatively, if employers knows that there's a higher supply of college-educated individuals and they're looking for jobs, could they be moving into, this is downward mobility, but to the other sectors and taking jobs from people who are in the manual labor or skill classes or et cetera, and then you're creating more pressure on unemployment for those who are not college-educated. Couldn't that possibly be an outcome of that system too?
Well, the way I see it now is that we have this crowding at the bottom of the class structure. Far too many people don't have access to a college degree, and so they're competing for a very small number of available low-skilled positions. And that's raising unemployment within that less educated sector, depressing wages, leading to all sorts of bad outcomes arising by virtue of crowding at the bottom, right? It's a reserve army of labor competing for a very small number of low-skilled positions. If we could reduce some of that pressure by educating more, by allowing more people to go to college, and then it would have all sorts of good effects at the bottom by increasing wages, lowering unemployment, good effects at the top, because it would lower the cost of educated labor, so there'd be more jobs there. So it would soak up some of that increased demand for college-educated labor by lowering the price of it and then creating more incentives for employers to create jobs in that sector. So, yeah, I'm just rehearsing what I before said. I see your downside, too, but I think at the end it would be a job-creating maneuver.
I was going to say we should end on that optimistic note, but we have two people who've been waiting to ask questions, so we'll take these two questions.
Thank you, David. Is it possible to counter the amplification effect you see with the professional and managerial class as they infuse more resources to their sons and daughters? I mean, is that ever possible? Or how much would inequality have to be reduced to counter those effects?
Yeah. That's a deep question, right? And one might say that this kind of family-based training is very powerful, and you wouldn't want to cut it off, right? I learned a lot about being a professor because my father and grandfather were professors. And so that's a very effective tool for reproduction that gave me some human capital that capitalized on the family system. And one might say it would be inefficient not to exploit that potential for reproduction and for human capital acquisition. I just rehearsed your position. So what's the counter argument? Well, I think there are deep and profound costs to violating our commitment to equal opportunity, and so I guess the counter argument would be that outweighs the efficiency argument, and I would in the end subscribe to that, not by cutting off reproduction on the part of those at the top, but by providing opportunities for those who don't have them through the family, and that's supposed to be the vision of mass schooling, right? To expose people to opportunities that aren't provided in their family, and if we committed to that in a more wholehearted way, I think you could at least counteract some of the inequalities that are vested in the family. So, but I guess that would be my very conventional answer to that very deep question.
Yeah, sorry that this is going back in what you guys were talking about, but I was kind of thinking about what Prudence was talking about, or saying, where she said we'd have an excess of like college educated people, but I would say I would think your point is invalid because you were saying if you could reap great benefits from going to college, once there's an excess, people see that there is no benefit to going to college. So I don't see how we'd ever get into that situation because there's just like no benefit once they see there's not that many jobs for them after going through college. So I didn't understand that kind of thought. That was like my only itch with your thought experiment. But in terms of what you were saying, this may be a narrow mindset, but if there was great social mobility but not perfect social mobility, I would think it would be ideal because, and even although there would be great an economic inequality, because it would really like stretch or kind of separate people who are like determined to go through college and who aren't. So I think it would be fair, I would say, just because people who are determined and like motivated to go through college, they know they would like reap great benefits, but people who wouldn't like want to take that investment stay in that kind of economic position that they're in. So I would say I think that I would go with your situation in terms of just like I do agree with there being great social mobility, but and no matter how unequal the economic statuses of people is. Yeah.
Well, let me pick up on just one strand of what you laid out there, if I understood it correctly, and that's that we ought to be worried that if more people had free and open access to schooling, we ought to be worried that the flood of folks into schools would then drive down wages to the educated labor force, and that might then cut off mobility through the education pathway because people would see the returns are low. And I guess I'm not too concerned about that, and this is why. There's these extraordinary compensating differentials, right? We have the most amazing jobs by virtue of being college educated that have all sorts of intrinsic rewards associated with them. Autonomy, often authority, lots of good things, intrinsically rewarding work that's challenging and rewarding in and of itself. And then, to boot, we get paid extraordinarily well, too. I don't think we need to be paid as well as we are to motivate an extraordinary flow of folks into this sector who would pursue it just for the intrinsic rewards in and of themselves. And so I think there's a great amount of over-reward within the college-educated sector. It's secured because of inequalities of opportunity that protect those who have a college education from full and complete competition from all those folks who would like to have it. And if we broke down some of those barriers, there'd still be lots and lots of people who would want a college education because there's so much to be gained by the sorts of jobs that are opened up when you have that education. So I'm not worried about this possible effect of a decline in the extrinsic rewards that are associated with jobs within the college-educated sector.
All right, we will end it there. Thank you very much, David.